Let's stop drafting these bum wide receivers with no upside and nothing to add to your fantasy football teams this year. Instead, let's look at these 5 must-draft wide receivers heading into the 2023 fantasy football season. Welcome back, everybody. Let's hop into my 5 favorite targets in fantasy football at the wide receiver position. Guys, I'm looking for huge consistency with that elite level upside in your 2023 drafts. Let's hop into our 5 favorite guys. At number 1, I'm looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown for the Detroit Lions. Last year, finishes at wide receiver 7 on the season in half PPR leagues. Yet this year, he's ranked as the number 10 off the board according to average draft position. I think St. Brown is a must-have wide receiver for a number of reasons. Since the 2021 season in Week 13, when Amon-Ra broke out in Detroit, he has the second most receptions in the entire National Football League, only behind one man, and that's, of course, the most dominant wide receiver in fantasy in the past couple of seasons, Justin Jefferson. But then you think, yeah, he's a slot wide receiver. Of course, he's going to have elite reception numbers, but the fantasy points aren't really there. That's not the case. Only 2 guys have more fantasy points over this last stretch since the end of the 2021 season. Aforementioned Justin Jefferson and Davante Adams. Only 2 guys having more fantasy points than Amon-Ra St. Brown over this time period. And I don't see a scenario in which this doesn't continue for St. Brown in this Lions offense. Lions, one of the favored dark horse teams in the NFC to make a deep run in the playoffs, not only win their division in the NFC North. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in that division, but I do know the Lions are going to be a very talented offense in this upcoming season and going to put up some pretty solid numbers. Not only do they have one of the best offensive lines in the entire league, but they have some weapons to go alongside that. Jameson Williams obviously going to be out for the first 6 games of the year. This is going to open up Amon-Ra St. Brown to be the target share boss in this Lions offense. He's going to be accumulating so many targets in the early portion of the season. While Jameson Williams is coming back towards the end of the year, I don't feel like this poses much of a threat for St. Brown, given that Williams is going to be that deep threat, field-extending wide receiver, while St. Brown's doing all of his work in the slot and underneath, closer to the line of scrimmage. Williams doesn't really pose a threat to that workload. So that, to go along with TJ Hockenson leaving this offense last season, that's going to open up even more targets for St. Brown. With a quarterback like Jared Goff, who we've seen has been very productive in his home games in Detroit. I love slamming St. Brown in the second round. His average draft position is around pick 20. I love taking him to be a dynamic and consistent wide receiver in your fantasy lineups for the entirety of the regular season. The next guy I am smashing in my 2023 draft is going to be Jalen Waddle, the wideout for the Miami Dolphins. Last year, Waddle finished as the wide receiver 8 in half PPR leagues. This year, he goes at wide receiver 11 off the boards at current average draft position. Getting Waddle in the 3rd round is an absolute no-brainer pick for me. I love taking him everywhere I can in those 10-man leagues in the 3rd round, and even in the late 2nd round for those 12-man leagues. The splits we saw Waddle with and without Tua on the field are absolutely night and day. Waddle's numbers with Tua at quarterback, he's a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy. So getting him at wide receiver 11 is mind-blowing in my opinion. Waddle was a top performer in some of the most predictive fantasy stats there are. Waddle led the entire league in yards per target. Not only this, he's number 3 in yards per route run. This yards per route run is one of the most important statistics to look at when predicting fantasy values in the upcoming seasons. At number 3 position, only behind Justin Jefferson and his teammate Tyreek Hill. While Waddle's targets did decrease from his 2021 campaign, his efficiency was so off the charts in this Miami offense that there really are no concerns with Waddle and his player profile. Not only is yards per route run and yards per target off the charts compared to some of the other guys in this range, Waddle's also top 5 in air yards and average depth of target. So you consider these are 4 of the most important and predictive stats of fantasy production, and Waddle's absolutely crushing it compared to where the other guys in this range that he's going around. In a 10-man league, if I'm getting him in the 3rd round, I am jumping for joy every time I see him on the board. Tua is to stay healthy for the entirety of the 2023 regular season. Jalen Waddle is going to blow this ADP out of the water. He has potential to finish inside the top 5 of all wide receivers, and getting him at wide receiver 11 off the board is absolute robbery in my opinion. While Tyreek Hill did have a very impressive season last year, he also is getting up there in age, closer to age 30 at the wide receiver position, while Jalen Waddle is entering his prime in the National Football League. I love this talent of this wide receiver, and all the statistics are pointing to Waddle to continue this success in Miami and having a huge 2023 season alongside his counterpart Tyreek Hill with a healthy Tua Tagovailoa at quarterback. They do bring in Mike White to be that backup quarterback, so there is a little bit of insurance. And I would love to see him healthy for the entirety of the season and see what he can do with these weapons on Miami and see what this offense can do in the AFC East. The next guy I love drafting is Amari Cooper, the wideout for the Cleveland Browns. Cooper surprisingly had a very solid campaign in 2022. There were a lot of question marks heading into that season with the quarterback position, with Watson being suspended for a majority of the season. But Cooper still was very profitable for where he went in drafts last year. Had some pretty impressive wide receiver 2 numbers throughout the majority of the season. While his stock has risen in this year's drafts, you have to get him in the near 4th into the 3rd round. I don't mind paying this price for Cooper, considering Deshaun Watson having a full training camp and offseason to get acquainted with this offense. Let's not forget what Deshaun Watson was doing in Houston when fully healthy and given a full complement of the offense. He was a top 5 quarterback with options like DeAndre Hopkins and Will Fuller being very secure wide receiver options on the outside. Now, Amari Cooper is not DeAndre Hopkins. I'll be the first to admit that. His numbers can be similar to that. Obviously not going to be a mirror image of what Hopkins was doing when he was a first-round pick for the Houston Texans. But Cooper can get up there. Last season we saw him warrant the number 14 in red zone targets. So when the Browns were getting near the end zone, they were looking for Amari Cooper through the air, him and David Njoku. Not only this, but Amari Cooper actually had the number 11 team market share for all wide receivers. So while the Browns weren't throwing it that much last season with some inferior quarterback play, when they were throwing, it was going to Amari Cooper. The offense funneled through Amari Cooper through the air. Obviously, Nick Chubb's going to garner the entire load on the ground this season. But Amari Cooper should have a very solid year through the air with Deshaun Watson. He has top 12 upside for a guy that I think the floor is so high in Cleveland for what they want to do with such a great offensive line and offense. Deshaun Watson doesn't have to be elite for Cooper to provide value in drafts. He just has to be slightly above average for what they were getting last year when he had absolutely no time to develop any sort of chemistry with these wide receivers. Cooper's one of my most drafted wide receivers this year, stacking him with Deshaun Watson later in the draft. Such a talented quarterback with Watson, and he was given so much guaranteed money. You have to believe the future is going to be bright for this player on the football field, so I want to be attacking Amari Cooper in my drafts. My next wide receiver that I am drafting everywhere I can is Christian Kirk for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I don't understand what's going on with Kirk's ADP. Last season, we saw him break out in fantasy football. He established himself as the wide receiver 1 on this team. Yes, the elephant in the room, Calvin Ridley comes to town, but Kirk just had career highs in receptions, touchdown yards, anything you can name. Kirk just did his best in his entire career last season. While Calvin Ridley is going to step into a huge role on this team, I think this Jaguars offense is more than likely to support 2 wide receivers in this offense. Last season, Jaguars were a top 10 offense in pass attempts under Trevor Lawrence. And with options like Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, and Travis Etienne out the backfield, not to mention Evan Ingram, I don't see why this offense can't be top 5 in pass attempts this upcoming year. While Kirk does seem some more competition with Ridley, they're not exactly competing against each other. Ridley more of an outside type than numbers type of player, while Christian Kirk does a lot of his damage from the slot. Last season, 75% of Christian Kirk's targets came from when he was running routes in the slot. So you're seeing a vast majority of his targets coming when he's running inside the slot. Calvin really doesn't run inside that position. He's going to be more of that outside player like we talked about, running deep routes, extending the offense. Back when we saw him in Atlanta being a top 5 wide receiver, that's what he did with Matt Ryan. He was a deep threat, having a very large average depth of target and extending the field. He was very good at that, and I think that's only going to open up more things underneath for Christian Kirk and Trevor Lawrence. While I'm not necessarily fading Calvin Ridley, I think the disrespect on Kirk and where you're able to get him in drafts is so much more appealing than what Calvin Ridley's ADP is. Not to mention, Ridley hasn't played football in almost 2 years, so getting Kirk 3 to 4 rounds behind Ridley is an astonishing fact in my opinion. Even with this new competition in, they're losing players on this offense on the outside. Marvin Jones heads out of town, so there are targets and receptions open to be taken in this offense that don't necessarily need to come out of Christian Kirk's workload, who surprisingly enough had the 6th most red zone targets in the league. This is a huge number for a guy you don't expect to be a huge red zone guy, but he did have that in his game last season for this Jaguars offense. And let's face it, this Jaguars team under Trevor Lawrence could be the next Cincinnati Bengals, breaking out and solidifying himself as a top 5 quarterback in the National Football League. I want to be drafting as many Jacksonville Jaguars I can get. And while Kirk is one of the cheapest options in this offense, a guy who's proven to be a top 12 option last season, I love drafting Kirk, not only because of what I expect him to do this season, but the ADP is absolutely out of hand compared to some of the other options of this offense. Slam Christian Kirk in your flex position and be very happy for what he does under Trevor Lawrence this upcoming season. The last guy on my list today is going to be Sky Moore, the wideout for the Kansas City Chiefs. Definitely the cheapest option on this list, but for good reason. He's the most unproven product that I have on this list today, but that could be changing very soon. We're looking at a Kansas City offense that's losing a lot of guys on the outside, mainly Juju Smith-Schuster. They bring in Kadarius Toney to fill in some of that wide receiver help. We're already seeing Toney going down with another injury in offseason camp. I don't see how you could be relying on Toney to not only stay healthy for the NFL season, but provide you any sort of fantasy production, given that he's only been really fantasy relevant for 2 or 3 games in a New York Giants uniform. While Toney has all the talent in the world, he hasn't been able to put it together for long stretches of time. So trusting Toney with any sort of fantasy capital is a very bad decision in my opinion. While Scott Moore doesn't have that pedigree in fantasy just yet, he does have a second-round draft pick last season from the Kansas City Chiefs, and we've seen reports this offseason that he is stepping into the clear number 1 slot role for this team. I bring this up because Kansas City actually led the league in yards from the slot position last season. Now, a lot of this was done from Travis Kelce and Juju Smith-Schuster last year. While Juju didn't have a phenomenal season for Kansas City, he was definitely usable in a lot of weeks when you look at some of his numbers. So if Sky Moore going this late in drafts, I think he's definitely worth a flyer pick, as he's not that field stretcher like a Marquez Valdez-Scantling or a Mecole Hardman we've seen in the past. He's going to be used more in this offense to move the chains like a Travis Kelce is. So if I can somehow get the wide receiver 1 in Kansas City, this has so much upside and has such a profitable pick. People have been chasing this position in fantasy for a number of years now since Mahomes took over in Kansas City. Sky Moore might finally have the answers with Juju leaving town, Kadarius Toney missing time, and Travis Kelce yet another year older. Let me know what you thought of these guys. These are my 5 must-draft wide receivers. We started out with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Amari Cooper, Christian Kirk, and we ended it with Sky Moore of the Kansas City Chiefs. I love hearing your guys' feedback. Let me know in the comment section who you're drafting as your must-draft wide receiver. These are my guys. Let me know if you agree or disagree. I love hearing your guys' opinion. Leave a like on the video. I really appreciate it. It lets me know that you guys are enjoying the content. I would really appreciate it. And subscribe to the channel because we're coming out with more fantasy football content all off season long, getting you ready for your fantasy drafts. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you guys next week with another episode of the Fantasy Birds.